Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard, and welcome to How IDL Reduces Toxic Scripting for Healing, Evolutionary Scripting, Toxic Adaptation, and Regenerative Consciousness. I'm a retired licensed clinical social worker and the developer of Integral Deep Listening, often abbreviated as IDL. This course is designed as a 3-hour on-demand continuing education program for No, it isn't. Let's stop. Welcome. My name is Joseph Dillard, and welcome to How IDL Reduces Toxic Scripting for Healing, Evolutionary Scripting, Toxic Adaptation, and Regenerative Consciousness. We are born into layers of scripting: biological, familial, cultural, and social, that once served survival, cohesion, and meaning. These scripts are not mistakes. They are evolutionary achievements that allowed individuals and groups to persist under specific conditions. This presentation explores how adaptive scripts become toxic when frozen in changing environments, and how integral deep listening provides a method for regenerating consciousness by interviewing emerging potentials rather than reinforcing outdated attractor basins. What is scripting? Scripting refers to internalized patterns of perception, emotion, and behavior that guide how we respond to life without conscious deliberation. These scripts form through repetition, emotional intensity, and social reinforcement, not through rational choice. From an evolutionary perspective, scripting conserves energy and increases speed of response, but at the cost of flexibility when conditions change. The problem is not scripting itself, but mistaking scripts for reality rather than adaptive approximations. Why did scripting evolve? Evolution favors efficiency. Scripting allows organisms to respond quickly without reassessing reality from scratch. A critical distinction in evolutionary psychology is that natural selection does not favor truth, insight, or psychological well-being. Rather, it favors survival and reproduction within specific ecological and social contexts. This efficiency was essential in environments where delay could mean death or exclusion from the group. Accuracy is only selected for when it directly supports fitness or essential cooperation. As a result, many scripts are functionally effective while being developmentally limiting or psychologically distorting. A belief does not need to be true to be useful. It only needs to work well enough in a given environment. We can see this in both the psychopathology of addiction and the sociopathy of smart and talented people. This creates a tension between adaptation and meaning. Scripts that once supported survival may undermine authenticity, intimacy, or growth later in life. Individuals often remain embedded in collective or familial scripts that they have outgrown developmentally. IDL recognizes that cooperation with others often requires engaging with scripts that are no longer viable for one's own development. Rather than pathologizing these scripts, IDL explores how they function, what they protect, and where they constrain awareness. Evolution favors speed, efficiency, and reliability over reflection and nuance. In environments where threat is present, the organism that pauses to analyze is often the organism that does not survive. Scripting allows for immediate action without conscious deliberation. Threat response is a primary driver of scripting. When danger is perceived, the nervous system needs to mobilize instantly. Scripts allow organisms to respond before conscious awareness even registers what is happening. This is especially true for social threats, where hesitation can result in exclusion or loss of protection. Scripting also supports social coordination. Shared scripts, such as roles, norms, expectations, make group behavior predictable. Predictability reduces conflict and increases cohesion, which historically improves survival odds. However, these efficiencies come at a cost. Scripts are optimized for past environments, not future ones. What was adaptive under one set of conditions may become limiting or harmful under another. Evolution does not update scripts automatically. Development requires conscious engagement and differentiation. An attractor basin refers to a stable, self-reinforcing pattern that identity repeatedly falls into. These patterns organize perception, emotion, interpretation, and behavior into familiar configurations. Think of attractors as processes, like whirlpools or hurricanes, not things like selves or souls. Once an attractor is activated, experience is filtered through it. Certain meanings feel obvious, certain emotional responses feel inevitable, and alternative interpretations remain inaccessible. Attractors feel like how things are, rather than like patterns we are inhabiting. Attractors provide stability and coherence. They reduce uncertainty and create continuity of identity. However, they also resist change. Novel information is often assimilated in ways that reinforce the existing pattern rather than challenge it. Growth requires temporarily destabilizing attractors. This is uncomfortable because it involves uncertainty and loss of coherence. IDL works at the level of attractors by allowing perspectives that personify them to speak, rather than attempting to override them with top-down cognition. Attractors become fossilized when experience no longer modifies them. Learning stops, even though repetition continues. The same emotional conclusions are drawn regardless of new evidence or changing circumstances. Fossilized attractors produce emotional looping. You feel as though you are reliving the same situations with different faces. Groundhog Day. The narrative remains rigid. This always happens. People are always like this. I already know how this ends. At this point, adaptation becomes maladaptation. What once provided stability now prevents growth. The system is no longer responsive to feedback. IDL approaches fossilized attractors not as errors to be corrected, but as perspectives that present that present reality does not incorporate. Interviewing these perspectives reintroduces responsiveness and allows development to resume. Human biology evolved to keep us alive, not to make us fulfilled. Our nervous systems are biased toward detecting threat, remembering danger more vividly than safety, and reacting quickly rather than wisely. This negativity bias means that painful experiences imprint more deeply than positive ones, shaping automatic expectations of harm, rejection, or failure. When early stress or trauma is present, the body learns that vigilance, control, or emotional shutdown equals safety. This negativity bias exists in your dreams every night, which has dysfunctional consequences for your healing, balancing, and transformation. These biological scripts become toxic when survival strategies outlive the danger that created them. Chronic anxiety, people pleasing, emotional withdrawal, or compulsive control may once have been adaptive, but later sabotage intimacy, creativity, and growth. Effective strategies include nervous system regulation, somatic awareness, slow exposure to safety, and dialoguing with these survival perspectives rather than trying to eliminate them. The goal is not to override biology, but to update it. The body is the earliest and most foundational site of scripting. Long before language or narrative, the nervous system learns how to respond to threat, safety, and connection. Fight, flight, freeze, and collapse are deeply adaptive responses shaped by evolutionary history. These responses are stored somatically. Muscle tension, breathing patterns, posture, and autonomic activation all reflect learned strategies for survival. This is sometimes referred to as somatic memory, though it is not memory in a narrative sense. When threats are acute and time limited, these responses resolve naturally. When threat is chronic or relational, as in repeated trauma, PTSD, or chronic nightmares, the body may remain in a patterned state of activation or inhibition. IDL understands physical scripting as functional adaptation. The body is not malfunctioning. It is executing strategies that once worked. The task is to listen to what these patterns describe rather than attempting to suppress them. When physical adaptation becomes toxic, Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome describes how systems designed for short-term stress become damaged under conditions of chronic activation. What protects in the short term becomes toxic when prolonged. Chronic sympathetic activation leads to hypervigilance, exhaustion, immune suppression, and emotional dysregulation. Alternatively, chronic shutdown can lead to dissociation, numbness, and loss of vitality. These patterns are often treated as symptoms to be eliminated. IDL reframes them as feedback signals, information from the body that has not yet been listened to or integrated. Rather than forcing regulation, IDL creates conditions for dialogue with the underlying adaptive intelligence of the body. When the condition is reframed, the pattern no longer needs to repeat. You've heard that much of who we are is shaped by scripting. Automatic patterns of perception, emotional, and behavior form through biology, early relationships, culture, and repeated experience. These scripts are not mistakes or pathologies. They are evolutionary adaptations that once supported survival, safety, and social belonging. From an evolutionary perspective, scripting favors speed, efficiency, and reliability, not truth, insight, or fulfillment. Scripts work well enough in particular environments, even when they distort reality or limit development. Over time, these scripts can organize experience into attractor basins, self-reinforcing patterns that feel like how things are, even when they are no longer adaptive. When environments change, but scripts do not, learning stops. At that point, adaptive strategies become maladaptive, producing emotional looping, chronic stress, relational difficulties, nightmares, or rigid identities. The body plays a central role in this process, storing survival strategies somatically through tension, arousal, shutdown, or vigilance. Integral deep listening does not treat these patterns as errors to be corrected. Instead, it approaches them as functional perspectives that have not yet been listened to. By interviewing dreams, life issues, and transpersonal experiences, IDL reopens feedback loops and restores the capacity for learning and adaptation. This framework is internally coherent and consistent with evolutionary biology, neuroscience, trauma theory, and systems thinking. It explains why people can be intelligent yet stuck, why helpful strategies can later become harmful, why insight alone often fails to produce change, and why the body and dreams repeat patterns that no longer serve current life contexts. It also resolves a common confusion. The problem is not scripting itself, but mistaking scripts for reality rather than recognizing them as provisional adaptations. IDL makes sense as a method because it works at the level where change actually happens, within lived perspectives and feedback, not abstract beliefs. This material naturally raises reflective and practical questions, such as, which of my current beliefs, emotions, or habits are scripts rather than accurate responses to present reality? Or, where in your life do you feel stuck in repeating patterns despite effort or insight? What attractor basins organize your identity, relationships, or sense of meaning? How do your dreams signal outdated survival strategies? What might happen if you listen to these patterns instead of trying to override or eliminate them? These questions point toward inquiry rather than judgment, which is central to IDL's ethic. You can apply this understanding by shifting from fixing to listening. Practically, this means noticing recurring emotional or relational patterns as attractors rather than personal failures. It means treating anxiety, shutdown, control, or vigilance as feedback, not defects. It means using dreams, bodily sensations, and strong reactions as entry points for inquiry. It means practicing IDL interviewing to allow scripted perspectives to speak, revealing what they protect and where they constrain growth. And it means supporting regulation and adaptation by updating biology gently through awareness, dialogue, and lived experimentation rather than force. And that is why IDL is a dream yoga, a practical daily application of these principles. Applied this way, IDL becomes a form of evolutionary hygiene. It restores responsiveness where learning has frozen, allowing meaning, balance, and transformation to emerge locally and provisionally rather than being imposed from above. Families are primary environments for scripting. They transmit implicit rules about love, safety, worth, emotion, and belonging. These scripts are often never spoken, yet powerfully enforced. Attachment strategies emerge in response to the emotional availability and regulation capacity of caregivers. Roles such as caretaker, achiever, mediator, or scapegoat develop to stabilize the family system. These strategies are adaptive within the original family context. They preserve attachment and reduce conflict. However, they are context-specific solutions. Problems arise when familial scripts are generalized beyond their original environment. What kept the child safe can more often than not limit the adult's relational freedom. IDL helps individuals differentiate loyalty to the family from fidelity to present reality. Families unconsciously transmit scripts about worth, safety, and belonging. Children learn not from what is said, but from what is rewarded, ignored, or punished. Love may become conditional on achievement, obedience, emotional caretaking, or invisibility. Many people internalize roles such as the responsible one, or the peacemaker, or the achiever, or the invisible child, believing these identities are who they are. These scripts become self-defeating when adult identity is organized around avoiding rejection rather than expressing authenticity. People may sabotage success, intimacy, or rest because these violate early rules about safety or loyalty. IDL interviewing allows internalized family voices to speak and evolve rather than dominate unconsciously. Toxic family scripts persist not because they are functional in the present, but because they once preserved attachment. Fear of loss, rejection, or abandonment keeps these patterns in place long after their necessity has passed. Examples include parentification, conditional love, emotional suppression, and identity foreclosure, where a child's sense of self is constrained by family expectations. Attempts to simply challenge these beliefs often fail because the script is not primarily cognitive. It is relational and emotional. Correcting the belief threatens attachment at a deep level. IDL treats these scripts as perspectives rather than errors. By interviewing the roles, fears, and loyalties involved, the individual can honor the original adaptation while freeing themselves from its ongoing constraints. Cultural scripting refers to the shared patterns of meaning that allow large groups of people to coordinate behavior across time and space. These scripts include norms, values, moral narratives, definitions of success, and socially sanctioned identity categories. They answer questions such as, what is good? What is shameful? Who belongs? What counts as a meaningful life? From an evolutionary perspective, culture dramatically accelerates adaptation. Instead of each generation learning from scratch, cultural scripts transmit strategies for survival, cooperation, and reproduction. Culture functions as a collective memory, preserving solutions that once worked under particular conditions. Cultural scripts also reduce uncertainty. By defining what is expected, admirable, or forbidden, they stabilize social interaction and reduce conflict. Individuals do not need to negotiate every encounter anew. The script already exists. However, the cost of this efficiency is rigidity. Cultural scripts often persist long after the conditions that made them adaptive have disappeared. Superstitions are a potent example. Because they are socially reinforced, they can outlive their usefulness and become invisible constraints on perception, identity, and choice. IDL approaches cultural scripts not as truths to defend or errors to reject, but as adaptive inheritances that require ongoing reassessment. Cultural scripts, worth as performance. Modern culture scripts people to equate worth with output, status, and achievement. Rest becomes laziness, vulnerability becomes weakness, and uncertainty becomes failure. From an early age, we learn to perform competence rather than cultivate wholeness. Social comparison intensifies the scripting, training us to measure ourselves externally rather than internally. These scripts produce chronic dissatisfaction, burnout, and identity fragility. Even success fails to satisfy because the goalposts keep moving. Combating cultural scripting requires redefining success, practicing values-based decision making, cultivating intrinsic motivation, and intentionally stepping outside comparison loops. IDL style inquiry allows us to access emerging potentials that are not dependent on cultural applause. Cultural scripts become toxic when they punish complexity rather than support adaptation. Instead of functioning as flexible guidelines, they harden into moral absolutes that suppress difference, curiosity, and developmental diversity. In these contexts, shame and guilt become the primary mechanisms of social control. Rather than dialogue or mutual learning, deviation is met with moral condemnation. This creates conformity at the cost of creativity and psychological health. Toxic cultural scripts often enforce rigid identity categories, defining who we are allowed to be and how we are permitted to change. When identity becomes fixed, we lose that flexibility and societies lose resilience. Novel responses are perceived as threats rather than resources. IDL helps disentangle lived experience from inherited moral narratives. By giving voice to personal experience rather than imposing cultural interpretation, we can differentiate what is authentically adaptive from what is merely customary or sanctioned. Social scripting governs how power, status, authority, and recognition are distributed within groups. These scripts clarify roles, hierarchies, and expectations, allowing cooperation to occur efficiently without constant negotiation. Social scripts define who leads, who follows, who is heard, and who is ignored. They also regulate performance, how competence, loyalty, or value must be demonstrated in order to belong. While these scripts streamline group functioning, they can become constraining when they dominate identity. Individuals may learn to perform roles rather than respond authentically to present conditions. Acceptance becomes contingent on compliance rather than responsiveness. When social scripts override lived experience, individuals become trapped in maintaining status rather than adapting to reality. IDL creates space to listen beneath performance, allowing suppressed perspectives to emerge and inform more adaptive social engagement. Humans are deeply social, and belonging once meant survival. As a result, many of us are scripted to prioritize acceptance over truth. We suppress needs, soften boundaries, and silence dissent to avoid conflict or exclusion. Over time, social conditioning trains us to abandon ourselves in subtle but pervasive ways. These scripts lead to resentment, passive aggression, emotional exhaustion, and relational dissatisfaction. The antidote is developing tolerance for disapproval, practicing clean communication, and differentiating connection from compliance. Methods such as perspective interviewing and boundary rehearsal allow us to experiment with authenticity while maintaining relationship. Over time, biological, familial, cultural, and social scripts consolidate into an internal authority voice, often experienced as the inner critic. This voice claims to protect by enforcing standards, vigilance, and self surveillance. While it may reduce risk or shame in the short term, it often becomes harsh, absolutist, and exhausting. Fighting the inner critic strengthens it. Effective strategies involve externalizing the voice, understanding its protective intent, and creating dialogue rather than suppression. IDL's approach of interviewing personifications of both critic and nurturance allows these voices to evolve, integrate, and relinquish dominance. Transformation occurs not through self improvement, but through reframing power relationships. Here's a time to pause with another reality check. Families shape identity through implicit emotional rules, and early roles emerge to preserve attachment and stability. We've also learned that children depend on caregivers for survival, adapting to the emotional climate of family, which is a rational process, not a flaw. We can ask, which family roles are still serving me? Which ones am I enacting automatically rather than consciously? We can notice when a familiar family role appears in adult relationships and then ask whether the current context actually requires it. We can ask ourselves if roles like achiever, peacemaker, or invisible child have become internal identities that have organized our adult behavior. Has love or safety depended on performing a role? Is it reasonable that the role has become part of ourselves? We can ask, am I choosing this role or am I trying to prevent rejection? What feels risky about not playing it? We can experiment with small moments of stepping outside the role and observe what actually happens rather than what we fear will happen. Family scripts persist because they once protected attachment, not because they are still effective. Emotional systems do not update automatically. They preserve what once worked until something interrupts them. We can ask, what am I still protecting? What am I still protecting against that may no longer be a real threat? Instead of challenging the belief directly, listen to the fear or loyalty beneath it and acknowledge its original purpose. Culture provides shared meanings and norms that stabilize social life and transmit adaptive knowledge. Without cultural scripts, coordination and continuity across generations would be nearly impossible. We can ask, which cultural rules am I following because they are meaningful, and which because they are unquestioned? We can notice when we feel shame or pressure and ask whether it comes from lived experience or inherited cultural expectations. Modern culture often equates worth with productivity, status, and visible success. Societies reward behaviors that increase efficiency and output, so these values are reinforced early and often. Ask yourself, how do I treat myself when I am resting, uncertain, or not performing? Practice valuing states like presence, learning, or care, even when they are not externally rewarded. Cultural scripts become toxic when they punish complexity and enforce moral absolutes. Systems cannot tolerate difference. When they do not, they lose adaptability and resilience over time. You can ask yourself, where do you feel pressured? Where do I feel pressured to be right rather than curious? Where do I silence nuance in myself and others? We can learn to replace immediate judgment with inquiry, especially when encountering difference or discomfort. Our social scripts organize power, authority, and belonging within those groups to which we belong. Roles reduce uncertainty and allow groups to function without constant negotiation. Ask yourself, am I responding to the situation or performing a role to maintain status or approval? Notice moments when authenticity feels risky and ask what role you might be protecting. We've heard that humans often prioritize acceptance over truth, sometimes at the cost of self-expression. For most of human history, exclusion carried real survival risks. You can ask yourself, where am I confusing connection with compliance? You can practice tolerating mild disapproval while staying relational, rather than disappearing or appeasing. We've heard that the inner critic is an internal authority formed from accumulated biological, familial, and cultural scripts. An internalized monitoring system can reduce risk and enforce standards without external supervision. That is why our parents and society have created within us this internal critic. We can therefore learn to ask, what is this voice trying to protect me from? And at what cost? Practice externalizing the critic and dialoguing with it, allowing its protective intent to evolve rather than dominate. Overgeneralization of scripts. Scripts are adaptive only within the conditions that generated them. When they are applied universally, across contexts, relationships, or developmental stages, they lose their adaptive function. Overgeneralization occurs when context is lost. A strategy that worked in one environment is assumed to apply everywhere. This leads to behavioral rigidity and fear of novelty, as unfamiliar situations are forced into familiar frameworks. When identity becomes fused with the script, questioning the script feels like a threat to the self. Learning stops because new experience is filtered through old conclusions rather than allowed to modify them. IDL works by restoring context. By interviewing perspectives as they arise in the present, scripts are resituated within their original adaptive purpose, freeing consciousness to respond rather than repeat. What are some core strategies for rewriting toxic scripts? Toxic scripts persist because they operate unconsciously. Awareness is the first intervention, noticing when behavior is automatic rather than chosen. Dialogue-based approaches treat scripts as perspectives rather than truths, allowing them to express their logic, fear, and unmet needs. This reduces internal warfare and increases flexibility. Lasting change integrates mind, body, and values. Regulation stabilizes the nervous system, choice reclaims agency, and integration allows old strategies to retire with dignity. IDL offers a structured method for updating scripts through direct experiential inquiry, transforming self-sabotage into self-leadership rather than endless self-correction. Dreams can be understood as internal simulation environments that evolve to support adaptation. They allow organisms to explore possible futures, rehearse responses to threat, and experiment with novel combinations of experience without physical risk. Dreams integrate emotional, relational, and behavioral information in ways that waking cognition often cannot. They recombine memory, affect, and imagination to test potential adaptations. From this perspective, dreams are not random byproducts of sleep, nor merely symbolic puzzles to be decoded. They are active feedback systems that assess how well current strategies are working. When dreams are ignored, dismissed, or reduced to fixed interpretations, an essential evolutionary feedback mechanism is lost. IDL treats dreams as living processes that can speak for themselves when given the opportunity. Life issues and waking dreams. Recurring life problems function much like waking dreams. Patterns of conflict, emotional looping, or stalled development repeat because their adaptive information has not yet been integrated. These issues are not signs of failure or pathology. They are developmental signals, communications from the system indicating that existing strategies are insufficient for current conditions. Just as dreams repeat when they are not responded to, life issues recur when their message has not been heard. The repetition is functional, not punitive. IDEO approaches life issues as perspective seeking response rather than problems requiring elimination. When the underlying intelligence is listened to, repetition loses its necessity. Transpersonal experiences involve perspectives that extend beyond the personal self. They may include 4 different varieties of oneness: oneness with nature, devotion, emptiness, or the non-dual. Such experiences often challenge conventional identity boundaries and can feel destabilizing or ineffable. Because they do not fit neatly within dominant cultural scripts, they are frequently interpreted away or dismissed as irrelevant. IDL neither reduces transpersonal experiences to symbols nor elevates them beyond critique. Instead, it interviews them as perspectives with potential adaptive relevance. By grounding these experiences in dialogue, their information can be integrated into lived reality rather than remaining abstract, overwhelming, or disconnected from daily life. Here is our final reality check. Much of human suffering is not caused by wrong thinking, but by overgeneralized adaptive scripts, strategies that once worked in specific conditions and were never updated. These scripts operate unconsciously, shaping identity, behavior, and perception long after their original usefulness has expired. Dreams, recurring life problems, and even transpersonal experiences are presented not as random events or pathologies, but as feedback systems. They simulate, repeat, and amplify information that current waking strategies are failing to integrate. Their persistence is functional, not punitive. IDL is introduced as a method that restores context and dialogue, treating scripts, symptoms, dreams, and transpersonal states as perspectives with intelligence, history, and adaptive intent, rather than errors to be corrected or meanings to be imposed. This aligns with evolutionary logic, nervous system function, and lived experience. Strategies optimized for speed, safety, or attachment naturally become rigid when conditions change. It also explains why insight alone often fails. Because scripts are relational, somatic, and identity based, not merely cognitive. It makes intuitive sense that dreams and recurring life issues would repeat until their information is metabolized, and that suppressing or interpreting them away would interrupt a core feedback loop. The idea that listening restores flexibility, then rather than reinforcing dysfunction, is coherent and clinically consistent. So we can ask, where in my life am I applying strategies outside the context that created them? Which identities or roles feel too dangerous to question, and why? What dreams, symptoms, or repeating conflicts might be asking for dialogue rather than control? How do I distinguish between honoring an adaptation and remaining loyal to it after it has expired? You can begin by noticing automation, moments when you react rather than choose. Instead of correcting or overriding these responses, you can inquire into them as adaptive perspectives with a history and purpose. Dreams can be treated as experiments in progress, not puzzles to solve. Recurring life problems can be approached as waking dreams, asking what information they are repeating because it has not yet been integrated. When destabilizing or transpersonal experiences arise, you can ground them through dialogue rather than dismissal or inflation, allowing their relevance to emerge organically. Practically, this means shifting from self-correction to self-leadership, listening before fixing, restoring context before judging, and allowing old strategies to retire with dignity once their job is complete. Thank you for your attention to this presentation. Now, I recommend that you take this 10-question multiple choice quiz on how IDL reduces toxic scripting for healing.